Now if you have a look at these D port entries, you'll notice just the sheer size of them. If you have a look at the floor side, which will be the floor side of the port, you just take a look at that. It's a dimension there's 2 inches, right? And then through the center there, bubbles out to about 2 1/4. And then what would be here would be the roof of the head port, and that, you know, if you do an average there, that's a bit of a, say, 1 3/4 on that. So it's definitely got a wider opening here that leads and tapers down into the port. And like I've mentioned before on my videos, I never get tired of this. I mean, if you have a look at that well matched tunnel ram intake towards the stock 4V port down there, I don't know if that can zoom in. It's just, you know, it's just perfect. It'll only require minimal blending, and you can see the back of the valve there. But a lot of guys, which I, you know, sort of now after thinking about it and watching so many stuff out there on it, a lot of guys talk about this wall right here, and that needs to be as straight as you can get it going to the port, which I agree on. You sort of don't want this ramping down. And now what I've noticed on some of the early day Cleveland Pro Stockers, besides you know, hacking all this out and welding all that stuff there that, you know, Bob Glidden had done back in the days, which was badass, you know what I mean? He tried to get that that edge sort of as a straight shot, you know, that sort of shoots straight to the roof of the port. But what I've also noticed with some manifolds around, and, you know, not only for sale, I've seen some real vintage modified ones up for sale, and I've noticed freaky things on them. And not just on that, even some old school vintage pro stock pictures as well. A lot of guys got rid of the plenum itself, because if you add, I'll just show you an example here. If you add the plenum here, it creates then more of a wall and then more of a curve by the time it gets there. So what a lot of guys did was just run adapter plates, because these bolt patterns here, I've mentioned once before on my earlier videos, it's the same size as a Dominator 4500 bolt pattern. So what a lot of guys did, they either made a real thin adapter or even bolted the you know, their dual Holley Dominator carbs right on here, which you can, and that eliminates a further wall being up here. So by getting rid of the plenum and either doing a real thin adapter plate or even bolting your Dominator carb right on here, that eliminates that extra bit of wall that you would get here. So you're minimizing that to sort of get a straighter shot at the top roof, which makes sense to me. Okay, so by removing the plenum, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Look, it's probably both, depending on the situation or the application, what the deal is. So let's say, for instance, this deal here, we're just talking about all out race, you know what I mean, high revs, power making, drag racing deal. So, okay, so now by removing the plenum, yes, you'll get your Holley Dominator, you'll get it right close to the opening of the D port, and you'll get your butterfly pretty much right on here, right? Which eliminates that height that would have been a plenum here to sort of work around that wall and then try and bend and across, you know, gradually down that wall. So what'll happen is butterfly's here now, and I'll just do a more of a direct shot down there, which is fair enough. Now, in saying that, a plenum, right, it's basically availability in air between all ports. So what happens is, it's, you know, when there's a surge for air between all the ports, there's availability between all them. So they all share and they can all feed each port when they sort of need to or want to as these things ramp up. This is a naturally aspirated deal we're talking about. So by eliminating the plenum, now I think, which I agree on, I think Andy from Unity Motorsport Garage pointed this out, and I agree on that. Basically said that if you're going to go ahead and do that, you better have a lot of carburetor. Now that to me makes sense, because if you have a think about it, by getting rid of that plenum and having, you know, availability, insurance of air for each of those ports, you better have a lot of carburetor if it's going to be an individual deal. Now I agree with that a lot, and that makes sense why a lot of those early guys, not every guy did this, but some of the guys did it and they're successful and made power with it. And that just makes sense why a lot of those old school early guys bolted them straight down here, and even those Kendig 1250 CFM variable carbs as well, they had them bolted down straight on here. And that just proves that there's a lot of carburetor if you're gonna do that setup. And by having that carb, that size carb, that sort of replaces or makes up for the lost plenum. You know what I mean? The shared unavailable air when needed. So when that's removed, this deal here individually is replaced with a massive unit. And that to me just makes sense. If you think about the early day Kendig 1250 CFM variable Venturi carbs, you'll see a lot of setups where they were just bolted down here, and that makes sense. They had 1250 CFM, that they could flow, and they're variable. So as the motor ramps up, it's given this area here what it needs. And 1250 CFM was plenty, you know, to do its work. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's right or wrong to do that application. I'm just trying to work things out as far as, you know, all those vintage setups and just things like that, especially when you're dealing with vintage gear like this. You know, this isn't the latest and the greatest stuff, so you're working with old school stuff with, you know, thoughts of back then and thoughts of today. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. So again, you know, plenty of carburetor, and you know, some of those guys, the Holly Dominator carbs that they ran were between 1050 CFM to 1250 CFM units, you know, throughout the 70s and 80s, and they would have them bolted down right here, and that just makes sense. Big units and available massive air, because it's, you know, you're eliminating that that plenum. So you've got to have plenty of carburetor, the same thing. And that's just what it is. And yeah, sure, you know, by lowering it and getting it real close to, you know, the start of that curve, you're sort of achieving that straight shot to the top of the roof of the head port. So, you know, I'll go ahead and I'll show you with the plenum on here, and you'll see what I'm talking about with that on there. All right, so that's the plenum on here. This particular one has been hacked and shortened. So this plenum here has been tightened up. Don't ask me questions on that. It was just a bit of an experiment thing. So yeah, you can have a look here, and this is a hacked and shortened plenum. So you can only imagine the original plenums that come up that high. So yeah, so there's the wall there. So by the time, you know, you run a bit of a heat insulator or whatever you want to do up here, you know, your carburetor. So just think about it. It sort of gets all distorted, and even if your butterflies are here, right, so your butterflies aren't right on the back wall there, they're a little bit more in, if you can see that. So it doesn't really matter if you see here the disruption and turbulence and everything that's going on in here. You know, fuel will be hitting that back wall, hitting that wall, air, fuel, everything crashing into each other. It needs to sort of work its way down this this tall wall, and then make its way around that that ramp, and then to the top of the roof there. So that's what I mean. I mean, have a look at that. There's the plenum there to the other side, and like I said, this deal here, it's shortened and tightened up. So again, by lessening that height, you'll get rid of that wall. So you've already lessened that wall, and it only becomes now a minimal wall. and it sort of becomes more of a straight shot to follow in coordinates with the top of the roof down there. And you know, you obviously got your butterfly right here and all your fuel in air going right down there, which you know, some of those guys back then found that to work and possibly be better. This particular Tunaram Cleveland manifold by Wian, the 5994, the D ports are in this configuration. So this is a little different to the Edelbrock UR19. But anyway, if you have a look here, so that, you know, that slight curve in the wall there, that material right there is a little thicker than the actual wall that that goes down to the port. So what you can possibly do, you can sort of port out that section there until it meets up to the wall side where it's thinner, and that way you can sort of get that sort of wall and curve eliminated, and you can create yourself a more of a straight shot to meet the roof of the head port. So, you know, there's potential work that can go on here, but yeah, just wanted to point that out.